Sorry, I was muted. I'm Melissa from the Pikes Peak Library District, and thank you for joining us today. And I want to introduce Irene Shonle from the Colorado State University Extension Office for El Paso County. She's a master gardener, and she's done some other gardening programs for us in the past, and today she's going to talk about native plants for Colorado. Thank you, Irene.
Thank you, Melissa. It's great to be here today. So let's just get started. So we are going to be talking about native plants for Colorado, but we will talk specifically about ones that will do well in our area here in El Paso County. But before we start, we actually have to go over what the definition of a native plant is. And it may seem kind of obvious, but it's actually a little bit trickier than you might think. So the Federal Native Plant Conservation Committee says that it's a plant species that occurs naturally in a particular region, state, ecosystem, and or habitat. So notice already that we're getting into a little bit of trouble here because I might be talking about just plants that are native to El Paso County. But somebody else might be talking about plants that are native to Colorado, or maybe somebody else is going to be talking about plants that are native to the entire Rocky Mountain area, or even the United States. And so my native plant may not quite be, we may not be talking the same language, even though we're talking about a plant that occurs naturally in a certain area. We could also even get into like little details about habitat. So it could be native to El Paso County, but maybe it's only found up on Pikes Peak, or maybe it's only found in very dry, rocky soils, or maybe it's only found along river areas. So there's a lot of different, so this is still, a little bit tricky, just that we may be talking native plants, but we may not be talking the same thing. The other part we have to talk about is the timeline. So if, so it's when did this plant start occurring naturally? Because there's plants that have come in after European colonists brought them in that are kind of occurring naturally. So we like to talk about a native plant being that was here before the advent of European colonists in North America, because that's when a lot of plants from Eurasia came over with those colonists. Now, I also like to talk about an ecological or evolutionary definition, which is a little bit more functional. And that's from Doug Tallamy, who is a professor at the University of Delaware, who's written a lot of wonderful books on native plants. And that is a plant that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. So now we're talking definitely over evolutionary time scale. And I think that that gives you a little bit more of a sense of, of the importance of native plants. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. So why are we even talking about native plants, and why are they important? So we know that we are having habitat loss everywhere. This is something that's really happening. And every day we're putting in new developments. We have millions of miles of road. We have millions of acres of lawn. And with all of this human activity, we only have about 3 to 5% of the land on the entire country of the United States that is undisturbed habitat. If we include not just the developments, but agriculture. And that's pretty scary. That if you look at this, this space shot of the United States at night, you can just see how many places that humans have settled and how much of the land we've actually occupied. And so we're losing habitat all the time. And what we're seeing is that we're starting to suffer the effects of it if we look at the natural world. So I think most people do know that native pollinators are on the decline. I think the poster child are the monarch butterflies. They're in the news because they've had dramatic decline, although this year has been a slight uptick, which is kind of good news. And that's due to a variety of different things, but loss of habitat is the primary cause. We're also seeing other native pollinators declining, like bumblebees, and some of them have actually gone extinct. And again, loss of habitat is the key factor in that loss and extinction. And in fact, it's gotten so bad, it's not just the monarchs and the bumblebees, but it's gotten so bad that even back in 2018, the New York Times had as their front page article, the insect apocalypse. And a lot of people are saying that what we're experiencing is such a dramatic loss in insects because of all this loss of habitat, that it actually could start to change ecosystem functions, and just like the way our crops get pollinated and lots of other things. So it really is a widespread problem. And we're seeing it in the effects with birds. So we're also seeing bird populations plummeting. And if you're wondering why this has to do with plants, we'll talk about that in a second. But even the widespread and previously thought to be secure populations of birds have declined 50 to 80% just in the last couple decades. And again, habitat loss is the key factor in that decline. So I assume that, a reason that some of you are here is because you are wanting to help and that you wanting to create habitat in your yards, which is wonderful. I love that. But we have to do it right. So if you look at a lot of the popular literature, what you'll see is some well-meaning tips and suggestions, but they're missing key factors in them. And so if you kind of look at some of these things like, provide for bees and butterflies, and some of the suggestions are like planting for the birds. There's a lot of suggestions, but there are also some problems with what they suggest. So if we unpack that a little bit more, if we look at the butterfly garden suggestions, typically they will suggest, and these are good suggestions, so don't think that these are wrong. These are actually excellent suggestions. So if you want to attract butterflies in your garden, what you want to do is plant in large masses, provide a sunny protected spot, provide shallow water or mud for them to puddle, and don't use insecticides. Now the problem with these, so those are all great suggestions, but the problem is when it gets down to the plant lists. Because if you look at the typical plant lists, it could be a butterfly packet, it can be seed packet, it can be just a list of plants for butterflies. What you'll see is that they're geared towards attracting adult butterflies into your garden. And if you plant these plants, you will get adult butterflies into your garden. And so, but you'll see that the plant lists are almost all non-natives. And so you'll see butterfly bush, you'll see zinnias, lantana, cosmos, lilacs, all these plants. And you might be thinking, well, what's the problem? I plant these plants and I get adult butterflies in my garden, therefore it's working. But the problem is we have to think about the future generations of the butterflies. We have to think about the caterpillars. Butterflies are very specialized. So they actually need very specific host plants in order to provide food for their caterpillars. The caterpillars can't just eat any plant, they actually have to eat very specific plants. And the female butterfly, she actually will sense what plant that to lay her eggs on by sensors in her feet. And if it's a plant she doesn't recognize, like a non-native plant, she will not be able to lay her eggs on it. And each butterfly, can be more or less specialized. The most specialized are the monarch butterflies because they will only be able to eat one genus of plants, the milkweed. Whereas, some other butterflies can lay their eggs on, a wider range of plants. But most butterflies are fairly host specific and need to have the native plants that they recognize. So if you want to have future generations of butterflies, if we want to actually have those monarch populations continue to survive, or other butterflies, the swallowtails, the painted ladies, the mourning cloaks, if we want to have these butterflies in our yards, we have to think about providing host plants for the caterpillars. So I like to call that cater to the caterpillars. And we do have a fact sheet with CSU Extension on attracting butterflies to the garden, because one of the other things you have to realize is if you are going to provide host plants, you are going to have caterpillars in your yard, and you have to, again, not, you don't want to be squashing those because those are your future butterflies. With bird gardens, we see a similar kind of errors being made. So again, we have some good suggestions. Provide water in the form of bird baths or fountains, provide shelter, so this can be evergreen trees or bird boxes, and provide food for all kinds of birds. So the ones that are seed eaters, the ones that are berry eaters, the ones that are nut eaters, and you can supplement with bird feeders in the winter. These are all excellent suggestions. But again, we have the same problem that the plant lists are again aimed at attracting adult birds into your yard. And if you look at most plant lists, they include, again, a lot of non-native species such as bachelor's buttons or honeysuckle, pyracantha, Russian olive, which is actually even a noxious weed. And so we don't want to have those. But why don't we want to have them? Like, what's the problem? And again, it's the future generations of birds that we have to be thinking about. So the non-native plants don't provide the hosts for the insects, just like the non-native plants don't provide for the butterflies. And birds need insects in order to fledge their chicks. So even if the adults are seed or nut or fruit eaters, 96% of terrestrial birds require insects. They need that soft-bodied packet of protein and fat in order to raise their clutch of chicks. And Doug Tallamy, who I mentioned earlier, he had his graduate student look at how many caterpillars it took to raise one clutch of chickadees, and it's 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just for one clutch. So we need lots and lots of insects for the birds to be able to glean off of the trees and other things in order to feed their babies. And it's the native plants that provide that. So again, just like with the butterflies, most insects tend to be specialized. And so 90% of herbivorous insects, and those are just the insects that eat plants, 90% of them require specific host plants. And again, they can't eat unfamiliar plants. So you bring in some plant that, like a Russian olive, they can't eat that plant, or a pyracantha, they can't eat that. And so, and again, so Ptolemy, think of his poor graduate students, they went out and looked at some oak trees in the East Coast and found that there were 500 species of caterpillars on the oak tree, and almost, either none or just a few on some of the non-native species. And so you can see that the non-native species are not providing what our world needs for producing future birds. And so basically, non-native plants support 29 times less biodiversity than native ornamental plants. And so this is why it's so great to grow natives, because you can actually be providing food for butterflies and food for birds. And they're basically the bottom of the food chain. And if we plant non-native plants, we are not providing that bottom of the food chain. Now, it's not necessary to go in. A lot of people at this point are like, oh my gosh, I should rip out my whole garden. And that's not what I'm trying to say. It's not necessary to have an all or nothing garden. We actually can have both natives and non-natives, and you can plant them both in your garden. And as long as they have similar growing conditions, you can have them growing side by side, and the natives will still provide the benefit. So I have things like irises and lilacs in my yard because I love them, but I also have a whole bunch of native plants in my yard because I want to provide for the pollinators and I want to provide for the birds. There's other reasons though that you might want to choose native plants. Maybe you're not that into, that doesn't excite you that much, but think about what you could be doing with your, instead of a lawn, which you have to mow and you have to fertilize and you have to spend a lot of money watering, and you're just sort of constantly doing those chores, versus having just a low maintenance outdoor room entertaining space. That might be another good reason to grow native plants. And native plants are low maintenance because they're adapted to our local environment. So we don't really need to do much in the way of soil amendments. We don't need much fertilizer. You really don't need to use pesticides, particularly if you are interested in, having butterflies and birds. And you just basically don't have to spend as much time and effort. My yard, which is primarily native, in the springtime, it takes so little effort. I go in the spring, I cut back all the perennials and anything that's like looking dead. And that's about all the maintenance I do. It takes me less than a morning in one time a year. And then, maybe if it's really hot and dry, I do some watering, but I do very, very little maintenance on my yard. So that's really a great thing. If you're a busy person, that's a pretty great thing to do. So we also, know that water bills are coming. We're seeing water rates increasing. We're seeing increasing water restrictions. We're seeing hotter and drier summers. And we know that if you choose your native plants wisely, they can save water. And so in 2002, the Colorado Springs utilities, they compared water use between traditional landscapes and xeric landscapes, and they had water savings up to 63%. Some people overwatered those the natives. They didn't need to water that much. They're still nervous, but they easily could save over half of their water bill. And also similarly in Cherry Creek, there was a homeowners association that did a retrofit with xeriscape and native plants, and they saved hundreds of thousands of dollars and halved their water bill. So that's a pretty great thing to do. And if you're talking about xeric plants, native plants are often at the top of the xeric plant lists. And a lot of times, if you really want to go low on water, a lot of our native plants can thrive on just rainfall. And so look, they do it out in the wilds every day, which is fantastic. So if you are on, if you're just saving water, or some of you, I don't know where you're all from, but some of you actually might have some wells, you might be on a well, have a low production well, or be a household use only. And so native plants can help your situation there, but they can help all of us save water. So the good news about all of this part is that they really can make a difference. And so, and I really like this quote. It is now in the power of individual gardeners to do something we all dream of doing, to make a difference. In this case, the difference will be to the future biodiversity, to the native plants and animals of North America, and the ecosystems that sustain them. Okay, so I would like to take some questions here.
There is one question in the chat, and it says, what about clover for a lawn replacement? Or are there better native alternatives to a lawn that can still give a soft area to walk and play, etc.?
Yeah, so clover is not actually a real water saver in Colorado, just because it tends to be, so it's not native to Colorado, and it can provide, the bees some pollinator habitat, but it's not like replacing a Kentucky bluegrass lawn with a clover lawn is going to help save a lot of water bills. And so you could do something like grow, there's buffalo grass lawns, which are much lower water, and they still provide a soft place to walk. The other option would be to consider like just having, reducing your lawn size to functional space. So instead of having a big yard that, maybe you're not using all the time, just consider like, what areas do I really, like walk on or play on, or does a dog use, or my kids use, and then keep that part of your lawn and then convert the rest of it. So you don't have to do it again, all or nothing. So if there's something, if there is a little part of you that wants to keep, some part of your yard, but really consider it. So a quote I really like is, if the only reason you walk on your lawn is to mow it, you have to consider whether you actually, whether you need the lawn per se, or whether you might want to convert it to something else. So, but I mean, if you do want to have a lawn that is low water native, consider a buffalo grass lawn. And if you do want to look up on the Colorado State University does have a fact sheet on buffalo grass lawns.
Okay, take care. Thank you so much.
Okay, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Any other questions, Melissa?
Not at this time.
Okay, great.
I think you covered all of them in your response.
Okay, terrific. All right, so I will keep going then. So a lot of people, and I think this is changing a bit, but people still seem to have some misconceptions about gardening with native plants, such as native plant landscapes are boring or scruffy or weedy looking. And so I'd like to show some pictures that show some of the potential that they don't have to look that way. So here's a very colorful lawn that was created by Jim Borland in Denver. He would just collected a bunch of seeds and grew them. So it's a very exuberant lawn or yard. Here is a penstemon garden, which is a nice cottage garden look in Denver Botanic Garden. This is at the Chatfield Botanic Garden, and here's a very prairie and rain garden, but it's a prairie garden look, and it's really beautiful, particularly in the later months of the year. And here's another picture of that same garden. Okay, so hopefully those at least showed you some options. And so this is, again, like kind of getting to the lawn question. So, you could really consider converting all or some of your lawn, to flowering plants if you want to be providing habitat and if you want to be providing more, color and interest. And so we do have a workshop on May 14th. It's an in-person workshop if you are interested in that will include how to get rid of your lawn, because there's always a lot of questions and I'm not going to have time to answer all of those questions today. So unfortunately, we just don't have time. So if you do want to learn how to get rid of your lawn and how to reduce it, and some more ideas about low maintenance natives, you can register there at epcextension.eventbrite.com. So that's in person in the morning on May 14th. Okay, so soil preparation. You don't really, again, have to do much for native plants, which is great. You know, if you pick native plants that are well adapted to your soils, then you don't have to really amend your soil at all, which is one of the big expenses and big chores if you are trying to grow that. If you do have really compacted soils because it's brand new construction, there's been heavy equipment, or you're trying to convert like a walking path or a driveway, you might want to loosen it with a spading fork about 1 to 2 feet deep. Or again, if your soil is very sandy, which there are parts of Colorado Springs that have, very sandy soils, or if they're scraped off again due to, just new construction, then you might, you could add some organic matter such as composted manure to help improve the tilth, which is just the root growing capacity of the soil, and the nutrient holding capacity. If you have clay soils, which I know so many people do in the Colorado Springs area, there are natives that tolerate clay, or if you want to grow some natives that don't tolerate clay so well, you can actually build a berm or a raised bed 8 to 24 inches tall to help create that well-drained soil. And Kelly Grummins, who used to own Timberline Gardens, here's his recipe. It's, you have to take 70% of your clay soils, and then you add 10% of wood-based compost and 20% small aggregate or crusher fines. And then you can use that to create your berm. And that can be something that really helps with with creating well-drained soils. So just this idea of contouring your land, that can really help both, you can help you save water. If you, create a berm and then you plant into the depression, then the water from the berm is going to come off and get at the bottom. And so you can also direct your downspouts to that area and create a rain garden. So you can actually save water. And again, here's that same garden at Chatfield Botanic Gardens that is a rain garden. So it's planted in depression. You can see that the downspouts are directed into there, and it grows fabulously well, and they don't use very much water at all. But you can also create berms. And so you can create berms, plant the well-drained plants here, and then plant plants that like a little bit of extra moisture in the depression. So contouring your land can be a wonderful thing. We don't need to have that flat land. Also, with your mulch, consider using a pea gravel mulch rather than something like a bark chip mulch. Any kind of mulch will help to save water, but the pea gravel mulch will help native plants go to seed a little bit, which can be nice if you're trying to propagate them. And then also it can help if a lot of times the native plants don't really want a well enriched soil, and they don't want that extra moisture that the wood chips might hold. And so you can consider using a pea gravel mulch. So not a lot. I'm not talking about a whole yard of pea gravel. I'm talking about mostly native plants with just a little bit of pea gravel. You can also just plant your plants so closely together that they create their own living mulch. With watering, again, even if you're trying to reduce your water bill, you still need to water your native plants until they're established. So this is a common mistake a lot of people make. They think it's a drought tolerant plant, so I can just plant it and walk away. But you can't do that. They actually do need to have some time to develop root systems to be able to withstand the drought. So they're going to be very vulnerable just as much as any other plant to drying out in that first season. So water them when the soil is dry, and then gradually over maybe towards the end of the first season or the next season, you can drop it off to the irrigation levels that you intend to give them. And if you're trying to save water, again, water deeply but infrequently to help the plants grow really deep roots, and then to look good. If we have a long dry spell, you can just water them a little bit, because sometimes if you go out out in nature, what you'll see is native plants don't look awesome during a drought. They're still alive, they're still here, but they're not going to look their best. And so just doing some infrequent water, even if you're trying to get rid of your water bill, can be helpful when we have a long drought. Fertilizing is usually not necessary because, again, our native plants are used to our Colorado soils. And if you over-fertilize, that can actually will lead to weed takeover and then also weak and floppy and overgrown, not well-flowering plants. If you again have that new construction, maybe you can and you just have the soil that was scraped off, a small amount of fertilizer might be useful, but look for something that's a slow release fertilizer, and don't look for one that has a lot of nitrogen in it because native plants don't need a lot of nitrogen. So there's always 3 numbers on a fertilizer packet, and look for one that's lower in nitrogen, which is the first one, or at least balanced. And then with maintenance, it's the same as any garden. You just want to prune to improve shape if you have sort of more of an evergreen, or to increase vigor. If you have a plant that's getting older, if there's any injured or diseased material, you want to get rid of those. Or again, what I do every springtime is cut back all of the old perennials, and so that way all the new growth doesn't have to come up and looking through the old perennials. And then there's always a question, should I deadhead or should I not deadhead plants? And it's kind of up to you. Rarely will a deadheading, and that's the deadheading, if you don't know what that is, it's just taking spent flowers and not letting them go to seed. It rarely will encourage repeat bloom with native plants. So you're not going to get your penstemons to rebloom just because you deadhead them. And you might want to consider just leaving seeds to help reseed if you want to have more of those plants. Or, maybe the seeds can stay on for winter interest, or for birds or caterpillars, or even just, there's a lot of reasons to leave the seed on. So I wouldn't bother with this particular chore if I were you. All right, so we're going to get on into species, but let's see if there are any other questions before we do that.
There is one question that says, what is the K in the NPK?
So yes, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So K is potassium. Good question. Yeah, that's always it. Yeah, so it's always NPK is how we always talk about it, but it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you ever want to know how to remember that, I always think of the 2 S's in potassium, and then I think of KISS. So K, because anyway, that might be more than you wanted to know, but that's how I always remember it. All right, any other questions?
Just one about the slides that you're presenting. So there will be a handout that Irene will share with me, and I will email that out to everyone.
And this is being recorded, and it will be posted on the YouTube channel of the library. So if you do need to go back and refer to anything, you can look at it there. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the species. So let's start with shrubs. So shrubs are kind of the rock stars of the garden in a way, in terms especially of habitat, but also just in the structure that they provide. Colorado doesn't do great with trees. We don't have so many deciduous trees in Colorado. We've got evergreens, and then we have some deciduous trees along the rivers, but we don't have trees we don't have a ton of trees. It's not like in the East Coast where you have whole forests of deciduous trees. We just don't do well with trees because we have a wacky climate here. And so do so much better with shrubs. And also shrubs are the rock stars of the garden because they provide flowers, they provide fruit, they provide habitat for, they're host plants. So they're really great to plant. And so, stuffing as many native shrubs in as possible is great. So, and I do try to indicate some deer resistance on these just because I know that a lot of people do deal with deer. So serviceberry has beautiful frosts of white flower in the springtime. They produce blueberries, which are edible for humans or for birds. And then they turn a lovely orangish color in the fall. Kinnikinick is a low growing evergreen plant. So this is a non-needle based evergreen. It's a broadleaf evergreen. And this will grow in the shade of trees. So a lot of people have a difficult place where it's under, like under some pine trees or in the north side of their house. The kinnikinick can actually withstand shade. And it has beautiful glossy berries, pink flowers in the springtime, And then, I'm sorry, beautiful glossy green leaves, and then it has red berries in the fall. So you can actually even use these as holiday decorations if you want to. Western sage is a fantastic shrub. It looks really good in sort of modern xeriscape plantings. It has such a beautiful silvery gray or blue-gray color to its leaves, and it smells fantastic after rain. It can get a little bit woody, so this is something that benefits from rejuvenative planting. So once you start to see it getting a little bit woody and the leaves aren't growing as fluffy anymore, then you'd want to, cut back a few of the branches, just 1 or 2 every year down to the ground and let it regrow. And so that way you can kind of keep the plant at a younger stage for more of its life. Curl-leaf mountain mahogany is a less commonly known plant, but it has this beautiful white bark, and it has, again, these are broadleaf. It's a broadleaf evergreen, so it does not lose its leaves, and it makes a really good screen plant. It's not like the most wildly interesting plant, but having a non-evergreen or like a non-pine, a non-conifer screen can be attractive to some people. So this is just another option. Rabbit brush we see a lot around here, but it is one of the rock stars of the fall garden. It has beautiful yellow flowers, super, super attractive to a lot of different butterflies. And it is one of the last pollinator plants. And so if you are trying to create habitat, this is one of the best plants that you can plant because as the people say, it's the last bar open in town. It's, and you do need to provide for those insects in the fall as well as the rest of the summer. Plus, I love it because it has beautiful seed heads in the fall that look gorgeous with the sort of low angled light of winter. So I think it's a fantastic plant to have in your yard. Apache plume is another rock star. It's super drought tolerant. It blooms for most of the entire summer with these white little rose-shaped flowers. Bees love it. And then it also produces these pink fluffy seed heads. Goldfinches will come to these. And it's just like an always interesting, always attractive shrub, again, that's super, super drought tolerant. Rock spray is a cool looking shrub. It has these big sprays of sort of creamyish pink flowers. This can also take some part shade, and it just has this beautiful presence in the yard, and it also does attract a lot of different pollinators. Creeping Mahonia is another one that can grow in the shade. So this is another one, if you have those difficult dry shade areas, Creeping Mahonia is perfect for that. Plus it's evergreen, so it's a broadleaf evergreen, has yellow flowers in the springtime that smell like honey. They smell so good. And then it has blue berries that come later. They're not particularly tasty, but they're not poisonous or anything, but they're really very bland. And then it has sort of reddish tones in the winter time. So this is a plant for all seasons, and it can grow even in dry shade, although it can take, part shade, and it can also even take full sun. Although if you do grow it in full sun, it might get a little bit of winter burn. American plums are on the verge of blooming, and they are one of the most delicious fragrances in my view. They just smell fantastic. They're also some of the very first plants that are out there for pollinators. So they are blooming, with the daffodils, and they're blooming just when the first, even dandelions are coming out. And so they provide some of the very first pollen for pollinators. Plus they smell really good, and they provide little fruits that are edible. In fact, they make pretty good like plum tarts and other kinds of things. Shrubby cinquefoil is a tough plant. It comes from the higher mountains in more wetland areas, and yet it can take the parking lot strips of McDonald's. And so this is kind of amazing how tough it is. Now, it blooms for a long season, and it does attract a variety of different pollinators. Sandcherry is a super cool shrub. It has fragrant white flowers in the springtime, blooms about the same time as plums, and it is related. Oh, and both the plum and the sandcherry are great host plants for a lot of different insects, a lot of different butterflies, caterpillars. But so the sandcherry has, these white fragrant flowers, and then they produce cherries that are edible. You can go ahead and eat them or leave them for the birds, and then turns a beautiful red in the fall. There's a plant select selection called Pawnee Buttes that is a lower growing and more of almost a ground cover effect. And that is a beautiful shrub. Chokecherry is one of the best host plants that you can have. It's a taller, it's more, it's kind of a suckering shrub, although you can get ones like sucker stop. There's a special variety called sucker stop that doesn't have that suckering habitat. But if you have some room, you can actually plant chokecherry and let it kind of grow as a hedge, which is fantastic for habitat. It has white fragrant flowers in the spring, glossy blackberries, which you can use for like syrups and wines and things like that, but they're not good for fresh eating at all because they're very tart and astringent. And then it does have a beautiful red fall color. You can also, this can either be grown as a single trunk, more of a tree variety, or again, you can let it grow as a multi-trunked shrub. But do be aware that if you just kind of let it go out of hand and you give it good soil and good water, it is going to spread. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that this would be that it's always a well-behaved plant. So you can grow it as a single trunk, but you might have to be cutting back some suckers every year. Not very well-known tree is the wafer ash, also known as the hop tree. It has fragrant flowers in the spring, although it does seem to vary a little bit by the individual how fragrant it is, and also the individual nose smelling it, whether you think it's fragrant or I guess it's one of those smells that some people think smells great and then other people find a little bit disagreeable. So I personally think it smells great, but your nose might differ. Anyway, but it's a very tough tree, grows wild, and it has, just it's a kind of a small tree. It's not a big shade tree, but it's more of a patio sized tree. It turns a lovely yellow in the fall, and then has these kind of cool wafers, which is why it's called the wafer ash. Golden currant is one of my favorites. It has yellow flowers in the springtime, so you could use it as a forsythia alternative. Has blackish berries that are edible for you or for birds. They sometimes can be kind of an orangish color, but they're somewhere in between. That turns beautiful red in the fall. Boulder raspberry has gorgeous white flowers in the springtime, kind of a cool peeling bark in the winter. So it actually has a little bit of winter interest, and it does have berries. Mostly they're kind of dry and mealy, although sometimes they actually can be juicy and tasty, but mostly the birds prefer them over people. And this also can take fairly deep shade, which is fantastic for those of you who are looking for shade plants. A regional native, so it's not quite native to Colorado, but a great regional native that does very well in Colorado is fernbush, and it has these little ferny-like leaves, which is why it gets its name. It has white flowers that attract a lot of different pollinators, and then it has kind of a rusty seed head in the throughout the winter months. Cheyenne Mock-orange is another regional native, and it has white fragrant flowers in the spring. It smells so good in the spring, very, very tough. And, so it's a plant, just the smell of the mock-orange is something that is, again, just delightful. When I had this outside of my office when I was up in the Gilpin County area, whenever it was in bloom, people would come in and be like, what is that shrub? I have to have that. All right, any questions on the shrubs before I get to perennials?
There were a couple of questions. I think one got answered by one of the participants, but I'll ask it again. What is a suckering habitat?
Thank you. Yes, sorry if I didn't make that clear. So it's a shrub that kind of grows by the roots, but then it sends out new stalks, from those roots, and so it can kind of just keep spreading by its root system. So rather than just be a single trunk tree, it's actually going to kind of come up and it can keep spreading and keep spreading, and so that's what suckering is.
And another question, actually two questions, where can we buy these plants locally?
Yeah, so that's something I'd love for people to chime in on if you've had some luck with that. There is a the Colorado Native Plant Society does have a native plant sale, and that is coming up. So you can, if you go to the Colorado Native Plant Society website, you can see their Native Plant Society, and there is a pickup spot here in Colorado Springs. And so you can get a lot of these plants through that. You can also just go to various different garden centers, like not the big box stores. You can almost never get very many natives at the big box stores. So like if you go to the local garden centers, I know a lot of them have them. We're actually trying to work on getting a list from the nurseries of which native plants that they are actually growing this year. We don't have that, but you always can, check with, we are trying to, see, they haven't finalized even all of their purchases for the year, but you can also, if there's specific plants that I've mentioned that you want to buy, I would go ahead and just call some of the big nursery garden centers in town and then see if they carry those.
And the next question is, and I will try to there's 3 more questions. What is a regional native?
So remember in the beginning when I was talking about what is a native plant? So the plants that I talked about that weren't regional natives are all native to Colorado. So a regional native is a plant that is like native to Utah or Idaho, or Wyoming or something that's right on our border, but it's not quite native into Colorado.
And is a tulip tree a shrub, and do they survive in Colorado?
So tulip trees are actually more of a tree. They're not native, and they do not do well in Colorado because they tend to bloom too early and they often get nipped by frost.
Okay. And I think you answered this, but I'll ask again. Can you explain regional native versus native?
Yeah, I got that already. So yeah.
And
all
then
right.
One more.
Okay.
Do you recommend planting these as seeds or as small plants?
So I think you can do either. If you are going to plant native plants from seeds, I actually recommend planting them in the fall rather than in the spring, because a lot of our native seeds want to have that cold, wet winter in order to break down their seed coat. And so you actually have much better luck if you plant native plants in October, native plant seeds in October versus planting them in May. So that would be, so if you do want to plant by seed, plant in October. If you want to plant by small plants, then plant them whenever you buy them. And they will be faster. So you're going to get a flower faster if you grow it from a plant, but it'll be cheaper if you grow it from a seed. So there's pros and cons. All right, so I'm going to go quickly through these perennials because I see time is ticking along here. So this is a beautiful plant, Pearly Everlasting, gray-green foliage, kind of a white flower, and it does dry beautifully, which is where the everlasting name comes from. Pussy Toes is a fantastic ground cover. It has beautiful sort of turquoise foliage, and it looks wonderful with stepping stones. So this is a good choice there. And here's just an example of how it looks. I think it looks beautiful with our the sandstone, the flagstone that we have very easily available in Colorado. And there is a variety called McClintock's variety, which has doesn't flower as much. And so like you can see here, this is it's starting to flower, and it could be a little trip hazard. This is not the Pussy Toes. This is a fringe sage. So, but if you do want to grow it, you might want to see if you can find the McClintock's variety, or it doesn't flower for a very long time and you could just easily clip that off. Golden columbine is probably the best columbine for our area, just because the blue columbine doesn't, it wants a little bit cooler temperatures, but the golden columbine can actually take the heat, and it blooms for a long time as beautiful yellow flowers. Various sages are beautiful in the garden. So this is the fringe sage, and it has nice, just sort of ferny look to it, or I'm not quite sure ferny is the right word, but you can see the look, and it looks so beautiful with other plants, I think, just because of that the contrast in the foliage. There's also the mountain sage or the prairie sage, Artemisia ludoviciana. Now this one is, again, it spreads by rhizome, so which is just the roots again. So it kind of spreads and it will kind of take over an area, which can be a good thing if you're looking for something that spreads a lot, but it can be a bad thing if you kind of want to take it, have it stay in place. If you want something that just will stay in place, then you want to go with this fringe sage. But they're both very drought tolerant and both have a nice fragrance to their foliage. Chocolate flower is a fantastic plant. It has a long bloom of yellow flowers that are very cheerful and they smell like chocolate, particularly in the morning and the evening. So it's fun to have them planted someplace where you're going to sit outside. I have mine planted where I like to drink my coffee in the morning, and I just love sitting there and smelling the fragrance of the chocolate flower. Poppy mallow is a very nice ground covering plant, and it again blooms for a very long time in the middle of the summertime. Harebells have a charming look to them. They'll kind of grow. They almost look like a little fairy garden. They grow in rock gardens. They grow at the front of the border. They look beautiful with a lot of different plants. Showy daisy will grow even in a dappled shade situation or in full sun. It blooms in the middle of the summer and is attractive to a lot of different pollinators. Sulfur flower is great for like a border area. So you can see how nice it looks here at the Denver Botanic Garden. It attracts different butterflies. It's actually the host plant to a variety of different butterflies. And here you can see it in the winter time looking lovely. So it's a really good winter interest plant as well. Blanketflower blooms for a long time in the middle of the summer and just looks like this is just, I think, just a fantastic look with the penstemon we'll talk about later. Wild geraniums don't get a lot of love, but they have a long bloom of these pink flowers, and then the leaves turn a red in the fall. Prairie smoke is a plant that can take some part shade to full sun, has beautiful rosy pink flowers. Bumblebees will pollinate them, and then it has another season of interest with fluffy seed heads. Scarlet gilia, also known as fairy trumpet when it's white, is a biennial, so that means it will flower in its second year, and then that plant won't come back. So, but it hopefully will have seeded in your garden before it dies. But it has beautiful flowers, and it's also attractive to hummingbirds. Blue flax is a great plant for adding texture in your garden. It blooms in the early summer, but it has just this very delicate and and waves in the breeze, and just new flowers kind of come out every day, and it has a gorgeous color of blue. Bee balm is a midsummer bloomer. It's very deer resistant actually, and it attracts bees, butterflies, and even hummingbirds. And you can even use it as an oregano substitute. White tufted evening primrose has, it's a low growing plant that has a beautiful white flower that's somewhat fragrant in the evening. Hawk moths will come to it. So it's a great plant to plant out if there's some place that you tend to eat, your dinners or hang out in the, as the air cools in the evening. Pasque flower is one of the first flowers to come out every year, and it's sort of like a little miniature crocus in a way that's not related to crocus, but it acts similar in your garden, and so it has beautiful purple flowers, which is fantastic for pollinators. And then there's a lot of spring blooming penstemons, such as the orchid or sidebells penstemon here with these big purple flowers that kind of look like orchids, and then the blue mist penstemon, which is a smaller flower. And it will attract smaller bees, but these will both be attractive to bumblebees and also like swallowtail butterflies, and they look fantastic blooming together. Rocky Mountain penstemon blooms more in the middle of the summer. It has, well, a little bit later than the other ones anyway, and it just has these spires of blue-violet flowers, great for bumblebees, but also hummingbirds come to them. Prairie coneflower has beautiful yellow flowers, although there's also a red form that is also gorgeous. And this will bloom kind of in the more mid to late summer. And it's a really fun looking plant in your garden. Black-eyed Susan it's a biennial. Sometimes it can live as long as a couple years, but usually it will die after its second season. But it's a great plant for attracting pollinators. And when it goes to seed, the finches will come and eat the seeds. Little blue stem grass is one of the most ornamental of our native grasses. It has beautiful sort of turquoisey blue flower blades of the grass in the summertime, and then it turns lovely reddish tones that last most of the winter. And so it's really, you know, can look gorgeous intermixed with some of your other plants in your garden. Golden banner is a plant, it blooms in the springtime. It is another plant that grows rhizomatously, so it's not a plant that's going to stay in a very small little area. But if you're looking for a plant that kind of can spread and take over a little bit of a hillside, or, you know, you just don't want to be, you have an area that you just want plants and you don't, you know, you just want it to take over, that can be a great choice for that. And it's very attractive to the bumblebees and to other kinds of and some butterflies in the springtime. It's just like such a cheery, bright yellow flower. Okay, I have time for questions. I think I just I kind of went through that quickly, but I wanted to make sure I had time for questions.
Okay, someone asked, is it legal to relocate native plants to your garden?
It is not legal. So unless it's from somebody you know's property or someplace you have permission. So if you can't just go out to the forest, you know, like, you know, open space land, you can't go out to US Forest Service land and dig up a native plant and bring it to your garden. You actually can't even collect seeds from most of those places. So if you do want to collect seeds from like the, you know, even like the BLM land, none of those places can you dig up a plant. Some of those places, if you contact the land agency, you might be able to see if you could get a seed collecting permit. But for the most part, it is not legal to collect seeds. Sometimes like the open space or like roadways can be places sometimes that you could legally collect seeds.
Okay, and then I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. Someone is always looking for something under pine trees.
Yes.
And that is rabbit resistant.
Yeah, so both of those plants that I mentioned that do well in the shade, so kinnikinick and the creeping Mahonia will do well under pine trees, and they're both rabbit resistant.
And let me scroll. Does Denver have a different microclimate? I don't know, PR does yours? I don't know what that means. I'm from Florida, but we'll be planting in Denver this June.
Yeah, so Denver's a little bit warmer than the Colorado Springs area. So so it does have a slightly different microclimate. It's a little bit lower in elevation and it's a little bit warmer. So so yeah, a little bit, but fairly similar.
Are there any perennials that would be okay to plant next to your house, or is planting close to your house always a bad idea due to possible water damage?
So yeah, no, there's a lot of plants that you could plant close to your house that, so, you know, ideally, particularly if you live in a fire area, you might want to consider just, you know, like like I know a lot of the people who might be on this, you know, might be living sort of in the foothills areas or just, you know, areas where you could have wildfires. In that case, you want to have nothing planted in the first 3 to 5 feet, and you want to just have like flagstone or something like that in the first, you know, 3 to 5 feet. If you don't live in, you know, a real fire-prone area, then you could plant plants that are low water. And almost all the plants I talked about today are low water. And you could plant them near your house and just water them. You know, you wouldn't have to water them very often. So, yeah.
I just moved to the area. Where could I find more resources to learn about natives here?
Yeah, so we've got a bunch of different, a bunch more information on native plants on the Colorado State University Extension webpage. And so if you type into a search engine, CSU Extension, native plants, we have booklets, we have fact sheets, we've got a whole bunch of information on native plants that, and I'll try to put these in the handout. So some of the links to the resources in the handout that I'm going to give to Melissa. It probably won't be today, so don't expect the handout today, but I'll hope to get it to her tomorrow.
Can we plant shrubs now when it's still snow, freeze?
Yeah, you can plant, yeah. Shrubs you can plant. You might not want to take them directly from the greenhouse. You know, like if they're in a nice protected, comfy little warm greenhouse, you might not want to put them right out and plant them the same day you buy them. You might want to kind of give them a few days outdoors to acclimate before you give them the extra trauma of planting them. But yes, you can plant shrubs now.
Do you think it'd be okay to plant 1 gallon or larger native plants in the ground in April or May? I'm told to wait until after Mother's Day to plant smaller annuals, sorry, but maybe the larger natives could tolerate the late snow.
Yeah, so you can actually plant almost any native plant now. So the annuals that you're, so anything that's like a non-native annual, like a geranium or petunias and all that, you do need to wait until after Mother's Day. But if you want to plant most of the native plants I talked about today, you could absolutely plant right now if you wanted to, because they're just a little bit tougher, and you could, so they don't. But the annuals, especially those tender perennials, and especially things like tomatoes, you absolutely want to wait until after Mother's Day. But you don't even have to plant a whole gallon size. You could plant the smaller natives right now.
How frequently do you need to water new plants to help them get established?
Yeah, so that depends on the weather and also what kind of soils you have. So if you have clay soil, you don't, need to water that often. I always say that, but it also depends, like if it's a really hot, dry time after you plant, then you have to water more often. So I always say that your finger is actually your best moisture meter, and you just go out and just, tuck your finger right next to the plant. And if it's dry, you water. If it's not dry, then, you don't need to water. But it's impossible to say exactly how often, but I would be checking at least 3 times a week for, to see whether they need water. And if it's really hot and dry when you plant, I might water every day for the first couple of weeks, just to make sure that they aren't suffering a little bit of transplant shock.
One last question. Are there any extension classes that you've already taught that can be viewed again?
We don't really have a mechanism for that, unfortunately. I'm trying to figure out something that we could do, but right now we don't really have a mechanism for that. I'm sorry.
That was all of the questions. There was one about the handout. As soon as I get the handout, I will email that to everyone. And people recommended High Country Gardens as a place to get plants as well.
That's a good mail order nursery. Mm-hmm.
And that was all of the questions.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much, Melissa, for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you all today, and I hope you consider planting some more natives in your garden.
Thank you, Irene. It was very informative. Thanks.
You're welcome.
And thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.